Newton, I want to ask you a quick question. How many Google corporate offices have a Popeyes?
Somewhere between 0 and -10.
Okay, perfect. No, I appreciate that. How many Google corporate headquarters would include, I don't know, I'll throw one out there, Qdoba maybe as like a healthy, the healthiest choice perhaps?
Uh, Same answer.
Okay, there you go. And that's why I would say that I think you guys are doing people first. You know, the military does a good job of providing for the physical side of the human equation, but I think there's a serious misappropriation of funds, resources, efforts, intentions, whatever, towards literally every other side of the human equation. Hey team, welcome back to another week with Drew and Alex. Normally, we are the hosts of the Mops and Mo's podcast. However, this week we have handed the reins over to a guest you may be familiar with. Newton Cheng from Google joins us. Alex, tell us a little bit more about Newton, if you would, please.
Yeah, hopefully you've listened to his first episode with us. Came out like 6 months ago or so. Newton is a dad. He's a hell of a power lifter. You'll hear a little bit about that in the episode. He's an engineer, and he is Google's director of health and performance. He leads a team with the mission to support the physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being of Google's global workforce. And we talk about that a little bit during this episode. But if you really want to dive into more of how Google does health and performance, I really recommend you go back to that episode. March 19th is when that came out. Title is Google's Culture of Health and Performance with Newton Cheng. Highly recommend it for a little bit of background because this episode is quite a bit different. Newton reached out asking to turn the tables a little bit and interview us, kind of ask what we did that original episode to talk about what the military could learn from corporate wellness. And he wanted to ask us some questions about what corporate wellness could learn from the military.
I think it was interesting because I hadn't even really thought about how the military is marketed to people who are not in the military. Obviously, Newton being one of those people. And he talks a little bit in this conversation about what his perceptions are around what sort of the culture around the military is meant to be. And we I think dismantle some of that, but then more broadly have conversations around things like, what are the trickle down effects of mandatory testing in the military? How do you balance the physical component of human performance with the need to have people who are cognitively resilient and cognitively strong, but may not be able to perform well physically? And what does all that mean when you create a human performance culture? So he says this himself. I think this is probably the first of many conversations that we'll have with Newton around corporate wellness versus military human performance and how those things are similar and how they're different and lessons that can be learned, et cetera, et cetera. So, hopefully this drives a lot of commentary online because I think that these are really important conversations.
There's definitely some commonalities that you wouldn't expect between corporate wellness and military human performance. And I think especially as military human performance, which grew up in the soft world that had a lot of parallels to like collegiate and pro athletics and tried to copy those models, as it expands into the conventional force and into different branches of the military and things like that, I think it's going to find that there's more and more in common with corporate wellness. And I think both organizations can learn a lot from that. And I think this is exactly what this conversation dives into.
Well, yeah, I think, my last thought on that is sort of we get very insular with specifically tactical human performance. Like we seek out folks in this space who do things that we're kind of already doing. And I haven't really heard a whole lot of crosstalk between, somebody that works with the military and somebody that, in this example, works at Google. So again, hopefully the start of more conversations to come and hopefully you enjoy.
Welcome today, Drew. Welcome, Alex. I'm super happy to have you on your own podcast where I get to pick your brains and learn from you
Happy to be here.
for free. We didn't sign anything, so I'm not going to pay you guys.
Yeah.
And so I'm very excited about the free knowledge from nice people.
We're officially not sponsored by Google.
For now.
That's okay. That's a very large group, so you're in very good company. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm sitting in the middle of a thunderstorm, so I'm hoping I don't lose power.
Oh, I'm
Okay,
sitting in the middle of
well,
a beautiful Colorado day, so I'm happy with my decisions recently.
This guy.
yeah, I'm in California sunshine. I'm also quite happy. So, Drew, you've made some interesting life decisions. Good luck with your possible
Listen,
power outage.
I am
We
thrilled
should
to be here.
we'll know pretty quickly if you got a power outage
Yeah, if you
since we're
don't hear from me for the rest of the podcast, I promise I'm okay. I've just lost power.
all right. Well, I'll talk a little bit about what brought us here today, and then Alex, if you just want to jump into like what we talked about before we started recording, just to give
Sure.
us some grounding, a starting point to ground on, I think that would be a good place to start. So I reached out to Drew and Alex because I work on corporate health and well-being programs at Google. And we have our own approach to that and how we support the health and well-being of our Google community. Now, Alex and Drew have a similar position, but within the military in the Army, although Alex has recently made a change. And so I just got really curious to say, how does the military think about this versus a Google versus, those are just segments of a larger field. And how do we think about it versus the rest of the field? And if we just picked each other's brains about like, why do you do what you do? Or why does your part of the field approach this the way it does? What would we learn are the differences and the similarities, and where is our undiscovered territory where we might learn from one another? So I just wanted to have an open conversation and pick your brains and see what we can discover together.
Let's do it.
Yeah, and the original email from Newton about what we would talk about used the terms corporate wellness and military human performance to categorize each of our groups. And so before the conversation here, I just went and looked up what those words mean according to various sources. And there's a few different definitions for each, and I picked a couple. For corporate wellness, Wikipedia's definition was simply activities, programs, and or organizational policies designed to support healthy behavior in the workplace. Seems pretty straightforward, a little bit generic.
Yep.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they were citing somebody's book here. I don't remember who, but I'll find it for the show notes. Their definition was organized employer-sponsored program that is designed to support employees and sometimes their families as they adopt and sustain behaviors that reduce health risks, improve quality of life, enhance productivity, and benefit an organization's bottom line. So I thought that one was a little more thorough. It gives you some kind of direction and grounding on what we're talking about here. And I appreciate that it kind of addresses directly the fact that even employee wellness or corporate wellness programs are executed with the bottom line in mind, being realistic.
Yeah, I'll say just a caveat. I largely agree with that definition or those definitions. I think the place where it's gotten blurry for two reasons. One is the pandemic and work from home, and then two is a lot of advocacy from, say, the public health people saying, hey, like in the workplaces, that's one way to define it, but that's like a very artificial boundary where the health and well-being of a person, it connects to their family. They're not in the workplace. It affects the local community. They're not in the workplace. And now that hybrid work is a thing, they're very often not in the workplace physically.
That's good points. Makes it complicated. So on the other side of it, we have military human performance, and I grabbed 3 different definitions here. Actually, I have 4. Sorry about that. And they're all pretty different, to be honest. The Consortium for Health and Military Performance, shout out, I used to intern there. Their definition is human performance optimization is the process of applying knowledge, skills, and emerging technologies to help you perform at your best as an individual, become part of a successful team, and accomplish the team's mission. Then RTI International, their definition, and I think this was from an academic source. I'm not quite sure. Again, I'll pull these all up for the show notes. But taking a holistic view of various mental, physical, and emotional variables that affect overall military success. Actually, thinking back as I read that is from a 2023, I think it came out in like March of this year, academic paper on how to kind of work out the differences between performance optimization and the military health system, so the actual medical system. It's a pretty interesting read. I will definitely drop it in the show notes. Then there is Booz Allen's definition, because they have some pretty big military human performance contracts and things like that. And they define it as human performance solutions that help trainees improve physical and psychological performance so they're ready to take on the future battlefield and carry the training throughout their lives, both during and after they complete their service. And then the final one I have, which is from military medicine, is the successful completion of a specified task within an available performance capacity that meets or exceeds the mission demands. I think that one's the most military sounding and least helpful, to be honest, but that's where we are.
So it's interesting. One thing that jumps out to me, if I take that last one where it's complete a specified task within, I can't remember the last thing you said, but basically like the given parameters, and it doesn't actually really talk that much about, say, health.
Yeah.
It's kind of implied. So I might define that as one side of the spectrum. And then the other side of the spectrum, if you look at the language that's used in things like internal marketing, not just out of Google, but many other corporations, it's very much around, hey, how do we help you like live a good life while you're working here? And it tries to frame it as not extractive as possible, where it's like, hey, like we're not going to talk about we will keep you healthy for the sake of the mission, the bottom line, etc. Even though if you think logically, why would a corporation do that? That is implied. And so I think that that's like one big difference that I kind of want to explore because grass is always greener on the other side, but I kind of like that the directness of the military approach of like, yeah, you're here to get something done. That's why we are supporting you in this way.
Yeah, I think we've kind of stumbled into like one of the clear ways we can compare the two programs is like how it's talked about in the organization. You kind of laid out how corporate wellness does their internal marketing and their conversations. The military, so the catchphrase lately is people first, and people first is one half of a bigger statement, which is usually people first, mission always.
I hate that so much.
And there's a huge conversation around it. Drew's not a huge fan, and to be
It makes
honest,
no sense.
If you're in the organizations, it's pretty clear that it's all about the mission. And like they're clear about that from day one when you're in the military. The whole point of like basic combat training and things like that is like subjugation of individual identity to the bigger cause and the mission and the goal and the unit and all those things. And so it's pretty explicit over here that the point of human performance programs is to make you more capable of accomplishing the mission. That's it. It's pretty direct. And there might be conversations on the side about like this will make you a happier, healthier person long term, lower disability rates, all that stuff. But it's pretty mission first in the way we talk about it.
And for people in the military, I assume there's a diversity of views where some people they say, I know exactly what I signed up for. And so yeah, people first, mission always. How do other people interpret and react to that? Like in the military, there's some people who say like this doesn't feel right, or I am not on board with this, even though I am in the military.
I don't know if anyone would be like so explicit as to say I'm not on board with this. There's definitely like if you sit down with people and like it's off record kind of stuff and you're having real conversations, people join the military for lots of reasons, right? Some people join the military because they didn't have a lot of other options. Some people join the military because they want to pay for college and they didn't want to take out student loans. Some people join the military because they've grown up being passionate about it their entire lives and can't wait to serve and are going to serve a lifetime and all that stuff. There's a huge spectrum of why people are there. And for that reason, people are motivated by different things. Some people are just there to like meet the requirements. Some people are there to achieve at the highest possible level and go do harder and harder things as much as they can.
And now if I compare like the versus the corporate context, so if I think about people first, mission always, I can think of an extreme example where you'd say, but within the military, you may literally get sent to your death on behalf of the mission.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to do some mental gymnastics to figure out how that is people first. Whereas in the corporate sense, I don't think there's anyone in our ecosystem who would say, I will die for Google. Maybe I'm wrong, but it would be a far, far outlier and that would not be expected. And so how do people try to make sense of that dissonance?
I mean, the people first thing, I don't know. It doesn't, to me at least, doesn't feel like it's meant to speak to, kind of what you mentioned, like quote unquote, the ultimate sacrifice. It's again, from my experience and where I sit, it's more so a catchphrase or a tagline that's meant to like say, hey, we capital W as the military will take care of you, your family, like your needs are important, you matter, less so people first, but also there's bad guys over there, so please run into that machine gun nest and like do what it takes to kill them, if that makes sense.
While Drew's talking, I'm trying to find a quote. Let me see if I can find it quickly here because I have it not too far away. Here we go. General Dempsey, now retired, and his line was, "If you need tents, I'll get you tents. If you need canteens, I'll get you canteens. If you need rifles, I can get you rifles. You can requisition that. What you can't requisition when the moment comes is trust, discipline, and fitness." And so I think of that quote a little bit when I think of the phrase people first, because it's easy to get distracted in like the day to day of military stuff by trying to complete certain tasks or maintain the trucks or like plan whatever collective training you have to go do or make sure the travel budget is what it needs to be, all the like mundane things about the military. But at the end of the day, what the military creates are organizations of people that like trust each other and are capable of doing hard things. And I think that's where people first really is like remembering that creating that group of people with those capabilities is what you are there to do. And it's easy to like sacrifice that for the sake of metrics when you're working in an office garrison environment in the military, and you're going to pay the price when you get to combat if you have overlooked developing your people and taking care of them and making sure they trust you.
So let me go into like a specific part of, say, human performance, and if I just narrow it down to say physical performance standards, where if you were going to go into combat, while it's still very dynamic and it's pretty hard to define, here's what's going to be needed. I know in shape is way better than not in shape. And so you can use that as a starting point to say you will need to be in shape. And therefore, I will define some physical performance standards. I'm going to apply them to the relevant people and hold them accountable. And then I'm going to try to implement and enforce them. Whereas in a corporate setting, I think those standards, I'm trying to decide why we don't have something like that. And part of it, I believe, is cultural. Part of it's probably legal. Part of it is it just defies definition in that context. And a corporation would have to decide, do I want to fight that battle? Like, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so now if I go back to the military context and think about physical performance standards, one, how are they defined? Two, who do they apply to? And then three, how are they implemented and enforced? And how do different people feel about that?
It's the ultimate Pandora's box.
Yeah. Before we answer those questions, I want to take a quick detour. When people use the phrase tactical human performance or tactical strength and conditioning, they also lump in police, fire, emergency services, rescue, things like that. And as I've had conversations with people in like law enforcement and fire specifically, because you mentioned like the legal difficulty of defining employment standards.
I think those
like
guys
that.
straddle the difference.
Yeah, they do straddle the difference because you start to get into state laws and you start to get into unions and you like all sorts of stuff that makes it really complicated because they can come up with a physical standard and the union will fight back and say like you can't prove that this is exactly what is required for the performance of this task. You can't enforce this physical standard. So the military is kind of lucky because it can get away with a lot more, frankly. Like it has the precedent, it can do that.
Well, in the military, you're property of the organization you're working for, which makes it easier to say, hey, you will do X, Y, and Z.
To a certain extent. I think we've moved away from the talking point of being government property. I don't think they enjoy that too much.
Sorry, but, people first.
But you asked, how do you define it? And
it's a great question.
Yeah, I think the military is in a weird place with that because like up until I'd say like 5 to 10 years ago, nobody seemed to really care about like how you defined it and how you correlated it with the actual mission. And that's where we had all the classic fitness tests that are like push-ups, sit-ups, and run.
Well, I would back you up even further and say that, and we had that episode with Dr. Reese talking about this. You could go back hundreds of years, but I would like To answer your question, I would say originally they were just sort of made up as a way of like saying, hey, you meet these minimum standards so we can send you over to Europe to kill Nazis. And I know I just truncated hundreds of years of history into like one sentence, but I think that's the historical paradigm that this generation of the military is sort of pushing past as we get into these more complex physical fitness tests where we see weighted implements, we see movement over ground, we see still some of the old stalwarts, like the running is still there, the push-ups are still there, but there's starting to be more of a conversation around holistic performance, lab-based events. They basically, what they try to do is generally the way that this works, and I've seen it play out on the Air Force side and now the Army side, is they get a panel of folks that have been to combat or been deployed or have some experience in that space, and they say, okay, what are the tasks that you need to complete, and then they kind of whittle that down, and then they do some quote unquote lab-based testing on those things, and they try to extrapolate field movements or gym-based movements that you can kind of trace back to those tasks. And you can see this if you go to the Army's ACFT website, like they'll correlate the deadlift with, a litter carry or whatever. So that's kind of how they spin the narrative around the why behind the events. But inevitably, you do get into a lot of discussion and debate at like a congressional level about, Alex can wax and wane for days about the leg tuck, what gets included, what gets taken away. But to your point, I think that the challenge is you can't really quantify combat the way you can a wide receiver's route or a GPS metric from a soccer player. Like I can't just say if you can do these things, then you will be effective at combat, because I've seen guys that can't deadlift. They can deadlift their body weight, but maybe not much more. And they come back from a deployment with all kinds of medals and awards. And then I've seen guys that can deadlift triple body weight and they go on deployment and they aren't that great. So it's hard, but recognizing that there does need to be a PT test, because you do have to have standards and you do have to set a bar, above which you need to pass in order to be an effective warfighter. It's an intricate debate and definitely a sore spot, I think, for a lot of people that are in the military right now.
Yeah, we've entered an era where the term criterion reference gets thrown around a lot, because like suddenly now they are trying to identify the components of fitness involved and then identify tests that measure a sufficient quantity of that component of fitness to make sure you can perform on whatever task. So they're trying to be more objective about it, but like you said, it's so complicated that it becomes a pretty hard conversation.
Well, it's complicated to the point where like you can get super deep into the weeds and be like, is it a hex bar deadlift for the Army because contractually we can purchase more of this item, or is it because that's actually an effective implement? Like there is so much red tape and so many layers involved. But I think I'll go out on a limb and say most strength coaches who are working in this space, in the Army space, would probably at this point say, hey, you know what, the ACFT, the Army Combat Fitness Test is a better approach than what we came from, which was push-ups, sit-ups, running.
Yeah, it sounds like, so if I go back to that hex bar example, at least the debate is happening. So
yes,
that's pretty complex. I could think of, like, should you do some sort of deadlift? I might advocate for that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think I give it a high probability of helping you develop some useful applicable strength. Now, if I start thinking about what I could do instead, like, okay, barbell versus hex, I'm like, okay, I think the hex just functionally is probably easier to execute. I might lower injury risk, which at scale is like a massive advantage. Mm-hmm. It's probably still functional in a way that's useful. Maybe I can just source more hex bars, like you were saying. And yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it. Like once, you can narrow it down to the movement, but then you got to think about, can we implement this in a system at scale? Mm-hmm. And then can we procure the stuff needed to implement this in a system at scale? And then there's probably red tape of like, can we get through the politics of getting this on the list?
Mm-hmm. Again, like you could go down so many rabbit holes with this, but what I will say is that I think back to kind of the original question, whatever you think about the movements that they've selected for these various tests, I think nobody would disagree with the fact that it has changed the way that people train, which is a net positive. Now that there are weighted implements, now that there is some speed power stuff. Now that, you are tasked metabolically, people are changing the way that they train. So you can't necessarily get away with just going for a run every day like you probably could have 20, 30 years ago.
Okay. And so that's a good description of the system. How is this implemented across, say, a population in, say, the Army? And then how do you enforce standards? Can you talk about the how the tests are implemented and what happens if you don't pass them?
Yeah, I could do a short version. It's been a phased in process because there was a lot of like fear when a new standard came out because people's careers depend on it. And that gets into the consequences if you fail. But like as of now that the phase in period is over, if you're in a reserve, like either the reserve or National Guard, you're a part time soldier, you take the test once a year. If you're an active component soldier, you take the test twice a year. And if you fail, well, first I'll talk about not the scary consequences. It does factor into your evaluations, which will affect whether you get promoted or not, whether you get retained or not, and things like that. But it's also punitive. Like if you can't pass the test, you can get kicked out of the military entirely. Those are the stakes. And you do kind of get like a second check. You fail and then you retest X number of weeks later. So there is that chance. Like they'll put you on a program to help remediate you, and it is your unit's responsibility to give you opportunities to train and coach you and things like that. But ultimately, physical fitness is an individual responsibility in the military. And so if you can't meet that standard, that's it. You're done.
And if I work a largely desk job at the military, where I might argue like, hey, I don't lift anything. Like I lift my laptop. This shouldn't apply to me. I still need to meet these standards.
Well, so that's a good conversation. Across the Army, yes. Like the Army treats this as a minimum standard, but like other services take slightly different approaches to fitness, right? So like the Navy and the Marine Corps have their own thing. The Air Force has their own test that looks a lot like the Army's old fitness test. It's essentially push-ups, like some variation of push-ups, some variation of a core exercise, and some variation of a cardio event. They've introduced some new flexibility. But you talk about desk stuff, and I think a decent number of people who follow MOPS and MOs probably realize by this point I'm working for the Space Force instead of the Army. And I think their approach has been pretty interesting. And this might help with some of our conversation about like the gap between corporate and military. That's exactly the hurdle Space Force ran into. They said, hey, we don't have a clear set of mission specific physical demands that we can point to. So we can't point to a clear standard of fitness to meet those. So what we're going to do is something entirely different. And they're not done with it yet. Right now, it's still a study. You can opt into it. It's optional. If you opt out, you just take the Air Force's standard test. But if you opt into the study, they give you a watch and they track two metrics, right? They track your estimated VO2 max because that correlates with overall health outcomes pretty well. And they track your weekly intensity minutes based on like the CDC's model of they want, this is for the audience real fast. I don't know if you know it, Newton, but the CDC recommends at least 150, preferably 300 intensity minutes per week. And the way that's calculated is that as long as you're over 50% of your max heart rate, you get one intensity minute per minute of activity. And I think the threshold is 70%. Like if you go above 70%, you get double credit. So you get like 2 intensity minutes per minute if you're at a higher intensity of work. And so that's what Space Force is tracking is as long as you get 150 intensity minutes per week, you do not have to take any kind of actual test.
If it's based only on heart rate, how do they keep space cadets or what are they, guardians? How do they keep guardians from just watching scary movies for hours?
Hey, man, it's complicated.
I mean, I'm sorry if I just pointed out a blazingly obvious loophole in your system.
They know that there are issues, right? Like they know that there are limitations,
They
just
know
like
there's
there are
limitations
with any test. Like
But
you could put your wearable, like I could put my watch on a dog and have the dog run around the yard for a while and probably get something. There's a bunch of ways
you could just get in an
game it if you really
argument with
try.
your wife and accumulate intensity minutes and completely supersede. Sorry, we're going
Not
on a whole different.
not worth it. I'd rather
Sorry,
do the cardio.
I had a rough night. I accomplished my intensity minutes though.
I mean, I'll tell you, I'm participating in this study, and there is some frustration because if you like, you can slightly get punished for being fitter because like my heart rate won't cross 50% of my max heart rate if I just like go for a walk, unless I'm walking really hard. And if you're out of shape, it might. I've also met people who like their stress level at work is so high that they're accumulating intensity minutes just by being stressed out, and that's a whole different conversation.
But hey, they don't have to take a PT test.
You're incentivizing like a stressful lifestyle for
I
them.
mean, hopefully we're doing the opposite, but Drew has
Sounds correct to me.
articulated a complication.
So question, like if I had to think about like, well, what would correlate with performance? Why don't you track sleep?
So that's been a conversation, right? Like there've been a bunch of questions about like these watches can track sleep. Why don't we do that? And the that might be in the future. Right now, it's largely down to privacy and what the consequences would be and things like that. It also is a little bit about accuracy of sleep tracking on some of these devices, which is not great. But is like, can your commander punish you for not sleeping enough when you were trying to take care of your kid? Or like, is this going to factor into your evaluation? Like there's just so many questions around it that they decided to keep things simple and not go down that path yet.
Well, and this is why, because the same conversations have happened in the conventional military around wearables, and I would assume corporate wellness too with wearables. Like to Alex's point, the challenge to me, at least, number one, is like the accuracy of the thing. But then two, if you marry your policy to a specific wearable, I can't imagine that the military, any branch of the military, is nimble enough to keep up with the pace of technological development. And we had this conversation, Alex and I, a long time ago, talking about Space Force before he was working there, and even with some of the folks in our network that deal with wearables. It's like if the Army, in this example, creates a policy that marries soldiers to like a Fitbit, the Fitbit is going to develop far and away faster than the Army's ability to change policy. So you could potentially end up in a world where 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you're still using antiquated technology because it's hard to keep up with the pace of that tech, if that makes sense.
It does. What kind of? I understand why you couldn't keep up with it, but if it's good enough now, why would you need to keep up with it? And that's a big assumption.
No, that's true. And then the other thing too is just like, and I've seen this play out all the time, is just typically if you tell soldiers what to do, or airmen or Marines or Guardians,
Humans.
they just won't do it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then maybe taking a rewinding a little bit, you had mentioned that depending on the branch of the military, they all have different standards and approaches. This feels like another Pandora's box, but I'm just going to ask the big question of why.
Ooh,
I think it largely comes down to like history and culture and identity.
culture. Mm-hmm.
And they also like, I mean, if you look at when each branch came out with its fitness test, they're largely reflective of whatever was popular at the time. It's like a lot of the Marine Corps has their combat fitness test, which is a little bit different, involves lifting ammo cans and doing things like that. But the core fitness test for each of the branches, I would say, are all heavily influenced by Cooper Institute ideas about fitness. And that just is probably because they all kind of got established around the time that like Cooper Institute and aerobics and jogging and things like that were all like the rage in the fitness world. And like the military might not appreciate this, but I would absolutely say that we are being influenced just as much by right now by what is popular in the fitness space now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's informed by the science and the physiology and things like that. But the military, their approach to fitness is largely following like civilian, broader societal trends in what people define as fitness and how people train.
Oh, interesting. And why do they follow societal trends versus, say, like, why wouldn't we just look at science? Because societal trends can be all over the place.
Listeners are not going to be able to see Drew's smile right now.
What a fantastic! Like, why wouldn't the military just follow science and do what makes the most sense, dude? I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with top-down pressure around what senior leaders can and can't physically do. We saw a lot of pushback, I think, with the ACFT on the Army side, because now all of a sudden, like, Newton, to your point about people working at a desk or people who have sort of, they're a little bit longer in the teeth, so to speak. Like, oh, I have to deadlift now? Oh, crap. I know the Marine Corps has like a rowing alternative to the running because they saw the value in holding on to folks that had more experience and maybe less physical capability. So I would love if we lived in a world where the military stayed abreast of science versus just ebbing and flowing at the whims of everybody who has a dog in the fight. But unfortunately, that's not where we are.
It's also kind of at the root of why we're having this conversation right now between people representing the military side and people representing the corporate side. Like the military is not separate from society. The military is society, and things that are popular in society are popular in the military, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not immune
Yeah.
from any of that.
I will say though, real quick, just if you look at the doctrine that has been published around the current fitness test, which for the Army is this Field Manual 722, it has more science than any of the other pre-existing fitness manuals, which were mostly just collections of pictures with guys in speedos doing calisthenics exercises. So they've come a long way in terms of justifying the why behind the movement. But then you get into the question of like, is the science accurate, and blah 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 blah. But they're moving in the right direction.
So I have to ask a really dumb why question, then I'll backtrack to more fertile ground. Why guys in speedos?
I'm thinking specifically of so I bought a first edition of the 1914 fitness manual after we had our episode with Dr. East, and I think the whole gymnastics movement and dudes in like really tight boots and really tight speedos was just in vogue.
Oh, this is the old time strongman era. I thought you
Old
meant like this
timey.
is like a manual from 1997 or
If
something.
you go, so if you go on Alex's Instagram, you'll see he still likes to train in tights, but far and away the pictures that I'm referring to have to do with the old timey strongman. Yes.
Compression technology, right?
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
tight,
Yeah, I
compression
think
technology.
I think we've been keeping our shirts on in the manual since at least the 90s. I don't know when that switch happened, but Drew is right that if you go far enough back, you'll start finding guys in like UDT
And I'll
shorts.
point out that they're all ripped. So,
So let me backtrack a little bit and try to figure out the calculus here. So that makes sense that okay, military is not separate from society, so we do need to acknowledge and sometimes follow societal trends. Is the calculus also, on the one hand, I can mandate this, but if the negative outcome is someone doesn't pass this test, I may have just like booted someone talented from the military, and that creates like also a big problem for me. So I don't want that happening at an unacceptably high rate. So I have to make the approach both as effective as possible in theory, as well as palatable.
Yeah, especially in the current era
yeah, exactly.
with recruiting struggling and things like that. Yeah.
Well, I think and again, I'll kind of put on my Air Force hat on this one because that was one of the dichotomies that they deal with is like, arguably you could be effective in the air with unmanned, aircraft, but you do have this sort of traditional culture around pilots. And I get that. And it's the same, I think, with the conventional ground force is the modern day battlefield. You see a lot of technology, you see a lot of stuff that allows for folks that have maybe bigger brains, smaller muscles to sit in a chair and be incredibly lethal from half a world away. But we're at a point where a lot of the senior leaders, a lot of the culture, a lot of the paradigms are still meshed with Vietnam, World War II, like even as far back as World War One. So a lot of people making the decisions and a lot of the narratives that are driving those decisions still kind of fetishize about we're in the trenches, we're going over the trenches, we're in the mud, like blood, sweat, tears. But to your point, there's guys who sit behind a screen and fly a drone that have been way more lethal than a guy carrying an M16, so or an M4. I think it's been a challenge around the human performance piece of like you lay out these really physically demanding standards, you do run the risk of losing somebody who cognitively is a really high performer, but physically might just not even be able to achieve the minimum.
This also ties in really closely, I think, with the Google problem set, right? Or the corporate wellness problem set, which is that I don't think anybody at Google thinks you need to deadlift a certain amount of weight to be a Google employee or run a certain 2 mile time to be a Google employee.
Yet we do not have that policy. Just make that real clear.
But I imagine that there are people around there trying to talk through, like, I think some of these people could perform better or last longer or be cheaper to insure or be happier, healthier people in general if exercise was a bigger part of their routine. And how do you accomplish that when you can't mandate things and there isn't such a clear requirement? And that's starting to become more and more a problem as more and more of the military are performing roles where it's not as acutely
Physical.
tied to something physical. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like, so if you look at any major corporation, whether it's a Google, an Apple, a Whole Foods, something I was going to say beyond tech. Whole Foods is now part of tech. I forgot Amazon acquired them. But so if you're on the corporate side and you're sitting like in different major markets across, say, the U.S. We'll keep this in the U.S. In California, for example, there's just more of a fitness lifestyle, at least around major cities. And so, whether it's people just mimicking local culture or it's actual knowledge and belief, they've integrated that, hey, fitness is a core part of my lifestyle in terms of how I feel good, both at work and life. And so, the bar for getting people on board with that, it's just, in my experience, it's easier. Now, I grew up in the Midwest, and it's a different culture there where I was just talking with a friend who just moved to Chicago, and she was saying, I don't understand why the portions are so large here and the food is so rich. And I'm like, well, you knew what Chicago style pizza was, right? Before you moved there. Like,
It's
it
lasagna.
carries their namesake. Yes, it's a lasagna pizza. And this is kind of emblematic of the culture around food.
Newton, it's fantastic timing for you to say that. I'm a Chicago suburbs native and just sparked a whole debate on Instagram, not realizing that apparently Chicago is very overrepresented among Army strength and conditioning people. And people have lots of
Really?
opinions on which Chicago pizza is the best one. So that was like yesterday's whole
Chicago
fight.
pizza sucks.
We'll talk after the recording, Drew.
Can I throw my opinion in there? I'll go Pequod's, Lou Malnati's, Giordano's.
In that order?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, those words meant something? I thought you just said words.
No, I grew up in Illinois.
I got a Pequod's recommendation. I got people advocating for it in the DMs. The battle originally started. JC Kuhn, Blue Crew, you guys are getting a shout out right now.
Oh, yeah.
JC is a huge advocate for Lou Malnati's, and I asserted that Lou Malnati's is definitely not number one. I don't know how this relates to
Are these deep
performance,
dish
but
pizzas?
I mean, you're in Chicago.
Chicago.
All
Chicago
deep dish
deep
pizza sucks and all that's like whatever.
It's like kipping pull-ups and pull-ups, man. They're just different
Be an
exercises.
adult, be
You
an
can't
adult,
compare
buy
them.
an uni and make your own pizza. Shout out uni.
As a weird North suburbs guy, I'm a Ferentino's fanatic, but nobody knows Ferentino's unless you live
I
in like
don't
two or
know.
three specific suburbs. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know Ferentino's. I think Pequod's has a little bit, it's not, a total niche thing, but it has a little bit more of a cult following. So I'm
Yeah,
probably
it's
trying to be
smaller but
cool
more
by saying
committed.
Pequod. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll stand by my Lou Malnati's, but I think depending on your taste, I could definitely see arguments for, like, if someone said no Giordano's, I wouldn't fight them on that. So
Seems
it's not my
reasonable.
I don't
hill.
know what's happening.
Drew's so lost right now.
I'm from the South.
I will say, fun story. I went to Chicago for a wedding. And so my wife and I went out there, and I'm like, the food is the best. We got to try everything. So we had the hot dogs, we had the pizza, we hit all the cocktail bars, the microbreweries.
Where'd you go for the hot dog?
I don't even remember.
I'm gonna go on record here. This opinion is stronger than my pizza opinions, to be honest. But Portillo's hot dog with everything is the way to go for a Chicago hot dog.
That's it. It was Portillo's. It was excellent. So we ate everything, and then we went to a wedding where they had an open bar, and I was a whiskey fan. So I basically just kept drinking whiskey. And then at at each dinner table, so that people wouldn't need to choose, they had platters of steak and salmon. So I'm like, great, I'm eating everything. And so we're flying home back to California, and I'm like, why does my foot hurt? And I thought I had sprained something, and it got worse and worse. I'm trying to stretch, and suddenly I'm flat out limping through the airport. And so I went to the doctor and I said, I think I sprained my toe or something. It's really swollen. It hurts. And they took a look at it, and they're like, do you have a history of gout? And I said, no, I have no history of gout. I'm quite physically.
Have you been to Chicago recently?
Yes, that's pretty much it. Like, I went to Chicago and I gave myself an acute gout attack by having too much fun. All got it done in one weekend.
That's incredible. Dietitians, if you're listening, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if any dietitians are like, no, you can't do that in one weekend, I call bullshit. Like, I have the medical records. I got it done I limped around work for a week while my coworkers laughed at me.
That's awesome.
Incredible.
But I still squatted on that foot because squats had to be done.
There it is.
Hell yeah.
Okay, where did we leave off? Okay, so different approaches. So
Regional approaches to fitness. Yeah.
yeah, California, it might be an easier sell, but like let's say we go out to a different population with like a less of a strong culture around fitness, and I'm like reluctant to name name where those places might be, but they know they're out there. And so, I can slip into the mindset of, well, if we could mandate something, like I feel like everyone would benefit from this. And so a part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation is I was really curious, like, hey, when you can mandate some of these things and enforce negative incentives, not that we would ever do that, what happens? And so what I'm finding from this conversation is I have a friend who they work in public policy, and they were saying creating policies, it's kind of like being a plumber. Like you do your best to get whatever it is, resource, behaviors, people to flow to the right things. And then afterwards you go search for the leaks in the system. And so what I heard from you is like, yeah, you can mandate it, but society's changing and you might end up ejecting a bunch of good talent from the system and just hurting yourself. So it comes with a clear downside as well.
Well, I think there's the mandating of, because we've been talking almost exclusively about the testing side of things, but there's also a conversation around the mandating of a particular approach to fitness. And again, like from the Army side, really, you could probably widen that net. Now that we're seeing embedded human performance at scale in the military across all branches, there's conversations around, do you mandate working with a strength coach or working with a staff, or do you have to see this coach, or can you do your own thing? Because I think one of the things that we have been up against is the way that most service members perceive fitness as punitive, and that can create an environment where they just avoid doing it altogether, even though there is that sort of black cloud, so to speak, of the PT test that you have to do, like we said, twice a year. So there's the conversation around the mandating of the testing piece, and then there's the conversation around the mandating or somehow the overlording of the daily training piece.
I'm probably going to trigger Drew here somewhat intentionally,
Oh,
but there's also so many questions about like other components of lifestyle that you can exert some influence on if you control the workplace environment, right? So the military has something called MNEAT, Military Nutrition Environment Assessment Tool, that dietitians do to like figure out what the environment is like in terms of what food is available. Because like more and more our like designated cafeterias are not getting used as much and not getting funded as well, which shunts service members over to like fast food options and whatever else, which is something that gets Drew real worked up. I think, frankly, corporate environments do a better job on establishing the nutrition environment they want to see. I just heard recently, we had an episode where a guy mentioned his buddy works at Trek Bike, and Trek Bicycles is kind of in the middle of nowhere, Waterloo. And so they like control the nutrition environment in their facility. They know what food they provide to their people, and you can create a healthy food environment if that's a priority to you. And like you can create walkable spaces and all sorts of things.
I mean,
like,
I would go so far as to say the corporate space, and Newton, you might disagree. Like you guys do people first better than the military does.
Ooh, hot take.
Okay, without having full context on what the military does, I am very proud of what we do at Google.
I have no context of what Google does, so there's my hot take.
There's various versions of it written up in the news, but if I go into like the food program, I think we don't believe in mandating choice. We don't want to be overly restricted, but we do believe in things like encouraging a plant-forward diet, encouraging hydration, having access to high quality foods. So for example, I can't remember if I told you guys, I'm not sure when we recorded our podcast, but in the last powerlifting season, I decided to go all in, and now I'm competing at the lightest weight I've ever competed at, which is 56 kilograms. Jesus. Which is, that's the right reaction. So
you guys can look up Newton's Instagram and see how shredded he's gotten for this.
Yeah, like normally I'd say like, oh, I'm not that shredded. I'm crazy shredded right now. Like there's no point in being modest. Like I'm crazy shredded. I'm crazy strong for my size right now. And so much of it has to do with what's available at Google and how they encourage us to make healthy choices. So yeah, I could eat, we'll just say less healthy every day, but they make it very easy for me to have a pretty delicious salad that's mainly just fresh vegetables and lean protein and hit my macros every day. And the result is I am a super shredded, sub 130 pound adult male who can deadlift a lot of weight.
I want to provide some context to my hot take. Apparently, Newton, I want to ask you a quick question. How many Google corporate offices have a Popeyes?
Somewhere between 0 and -10.
Okay, perfect. No, I appreciate that. How many Google corporate headquarters would include? I don't know. I'll throw one out there. Qdoba maybe as like a healthy, the healthiest choice, perhaps.
Uh, Same answer.
Okay, there you go. And that's why I would say that I think you guys are doing people first. You know, the military does a good job of providing for the physical side of the human equation, but I think there's a serious misappropriation of funds, resources, efforts, intentions, whatever, towards literally every other side of the human equation. So yeah, I will close my hot take now.
Oh, rumors abound, but I've heard from some like decently reliable sources that the Burger King on Main Post Joint Base Lewis McChord is the single most profitable Burger King in that corporation.
People first.
Wow.
It is
Okay.
crowded. There's a line of cars at all hours of the day. It's astonishing.
So maybe let's see. With the time we got left, kind of on the direction we're going, if we move away from the physical fitness side of things and consider the holistic human experience, because I think there's a lot of other things where you'd say, hey, there's a lot of other big levers to pull here. There's nutrition, there is things around mental and emotional health and social health, especially related to all of those things. Do you want to talk a little bit about? Well, we talked about nutrition. I'd be curious to hear if there's anything positive you have to say about the military's approach to nutrition. And then I'd love to get into the topics of mental and social health, because this is where we've actually connected with people in the military to learn what they're doing around mental health as well. So I'd just love to compare notes there too.
I think in corners of the military, and specifically corners that involve getting through several gateways, there's a lot more invested in those sort of soft skills. Broadly speaking, the military still, and I'll kind of use this to cage most of my thoughts. I think the military still operates from a biomedical model of human performance where the musculoskeletal injury rates and the sort of mechanized component of human performance far and away exceed everything else. Kind of case in point in that most of the metrics I'm asked for in my day-to-day job are strictly to do with musculoskeletal biomechanical type stuff. There's not a whole lot paid towards the soft skills. And I think a lot of that is because it's hard to capture some of that stuff. And I remember when we had you on the first time, we talked about some of that. Like, how do you show effectiveness in a program that prioritizes mindfulness or meditation? Like, what's the return on investment there? Because in the military space, everything comes back to dollars and cents. And if you can't show like an objective return on investment, it's hard to get additional funding for that thing. So most of the time and energy is spent on reducing injury rates, or, you know, this particular injury took this long to come back from. Now we have a staff in place. It takes a lot less to come back from that particular thing. So I understand why that's the case, but it is infuriating to be in that space and know that the psychosocial aspect of human performance is incredibly important. I mean, we talked about sleep, relationships, all these things play a huge role in how you do the deadlift on a given day. And there's just it's hard to be given the leeway as a provider, as an embedded specialist, whatever, to let those things play out at scale, because you're always held to the grindstone in terms of return on investment, return on investment, return on investment.
I'll make a really cynical observation, and then I'll make some more optimistic observations that I've seen in the last year or two. The cynical one is I've been in a lot of organizations or visited a lot of organizations around the Army and around the rest of the military. If a tank is broken, No one asks what the return on investment is for replacing the broken part and getting it working again. The benefit is that the tank works. If an airplane is broken, nobody asks what the return on investment is for getting it back up in the air. It costs what it costs, and the point is to get the plane in the air. And that applies across any weapon system, vehicle, whatever it is across the military. But when a person is broken, they want you to justify how whatever it costs to fix them will actually end up saving money in the long run. And I think there's a hard conversation to reckon with there about how we value tools versus humans. That's really, really tough and ingrained in the size of the bureaucracy and how it works.
So it's tools first, people first as well. ROI is there, mission always.
Yeah, to a certain degree.
The most cynical of takes would be people first, profit always. And I mean, that's
Oof.
like, I say that tongue in cheek, like nobody yell at me, please. Like, I get that there's complexity to that. But I mean, when you start talking about the food environment and all those kinds of things, like undoubtedly the Burger King on JBLM is there for a reason. And the reason has to do with money. And we've had this conversation with people on air, off air, at conferences, in the hallways, like on the, like everyone recognizes that there are competing efforts at place right now where the military is investing a ton of money in putting human performance professionals in place to increase readiness, return on investment with like injury rates, yada, yada, yada. And they are actively competing with motivating factors around putting restaurants on bases, increasing alcohol sales, all these things, because that creates profit. So I think at some point that's going to have to come to a head. Unfortunately, that's probably where they dump some of these human performance programs, but it's an interesting space to be in, because I would imagine like at Google, if somebody came to the table and said, "Hey, if we put a Burger King at this location, we'll make millions and millions of dollars," you guys would be like, "No." With the military, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I just want to call it that. That might be an unfair comparison because our business model doesn't force us into such conversations. I do look at something like a university student union where
Mm-hmm.
you also have a student body that may be struggling with both physical and mental health, and the Burger Kings of the world have no problem infiltrating
Mm-hmm.
a college student union. So that might be a better example or analogy.
With that behind us, I did promise to say some more optimistic things. And I'll say that by putting human performance staffs in places around the military, arguably one of the most important results is that you suddenly have people who their whole job is to care about the people in that organization and not the mission, because there are commanders that are still responsible for the mission, and
Mm-hmm.
that human performance staff strictly cares about the people. And that has led to some pretty cool things, right? Like we've suddenly seen a lot of dining facilities around the military offering like performance fueling meal prep options where soldiers can go and pick up like 3 or 4 frozen or microwavable meals or whatever and take them back to their room, and they'll be sorted based on whether it was like a high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity day, how many calories you need. It'll have the macros on it ready to go, and that's all covered by the soldier's meal card. We've seen that popping up in a lot of places. I've seen units starting to push back on really early morning physical training and by keeping people long hours of the day. So they start to change their schedules and track whether that leads to service members getting more sleep because they care about that. There are people putting effort in, and like sadly, not a ton of it is coming from the top. It tends to be like homegrown people in a particular battalion or brigade really caring about it and convincing a commander to put money towards it or make the decision. But there are pockets of things that I'm really excited about happening all over the military, and leadership at higher levels do seem to be like noticing that and underwriting it and endorsing it and encouraging it. So maybe that's all we can ask for, but there are indications that we're moving in the right direction on a few of these things.
Yeah, I do think there is a argument to be made of, it's a complex system, so you can't just change things overnight across the complex system. Like it just doesn't work that way. So the fact that they are willing to make those investments of something that stays in the system and drives change over time, I think is actually the best thing that can be done practically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could advocate for like, and we want bigger moves, but they're making the moves, and the moves seem to have staying power. So I would say that is a very big positive signal.
Well, and I think too, and again, specific to the Army, just with how massive of an investment has already been made in embedded human performance, I think it is one of those things that is so big now that it will continue to move forward. Versus if they try to just do it small scale, it'd be a lot easier to get rid of it if it ends up not meeting whatever quota somebody creates.
So let's see. So we've talked about nutrition. Some other things I want to dig into now are, so there's a very high correlation between like mental health and musculoskeletal injuries, for example. And so I know there's broader conversation around mental health in general in the military and in society. But if I just look at a correlation right that like that, and now tie it back to discussions, sounds like the military might be more willing to have when presented with data like that to show like, hey, like this mental health struggles can directly affect physical readiness. Does something like that help bolster the support for mental health in the military context?
So I think there's a couple pieces to this one. One, different echelons look at different things. So like Drew sitting at the brigade echelon is looking at a lot of musculoskeletal biomechanical kind of stuff. But I'll tell you that there's like the chief of staff of the Army and the sergeant major of the Army don't sit down every month and look at the latest stats on musculoskeletal injuries. Like they might get briefed on that from other sources, but they do sit down every month and look at suicides.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is a massive priority at the most senior level. Where it gets hard is it's difficult to just solve that problem. Like nobody can give a clear answer on like what lever do you pull to solve that problem. And I think some people are bullish on the idea that investing in like the broader domains of human performance, physical, sleep, nutrition, spiritual, everything will have like downstream effects on some of those mental health concerns. There are definitely investments happening in like actual mental health providers on military installations. I know like Alaska, for a variety of reasons, military units up there have struggled with some mental health stuff, and they've invested pretty significant resources in bolstering the mental health treatment resources that they have up there. Some of it proactive, some of it reactive. But I think like bigger picture, they want to try and figure out like what is it about command climates and what is it about different performance programs that can create environments that lead to reduce suicides and reduce mental health incidents and things like that. It's a hard, like you said, complex system. Who knows what directly can affect that?
Well, and I think too, like, we've seen statistics already on the Army side of the house that suicides have decreased in areas that have embedded staff. And I think that gets to a point that we made earlier about people first. And like when you do have folks in place whose mission literally is to put people first, you do start to see soldiers, airmen, Marines coming up to these trusted individuals and opening up and having hard conversations that they might not otherwise have. Because I think in a lot of cases with the military, folks still think that if you have like a suicide awareness 5K on a Saturday, like that's checking the box. And realistically, that's not really doing anything at all. But if you have a strength coach or an athletic trainer or a physical therapist whose job is literally just to approach you at a human level and you feel comfortable opening up to that person and that keeps you from causing harm to yourself, I think to Alex's point about second and third order effects and sort of over time, we'll start to see those things go down because intentionally or otherwise, we have created a people first environment.
Yeah, so now this kind of goes into deeper territory, maybe around culture, around stigma of like you've embedded that coach. So maybe that coach can build a relationship over time, get people to open up about what might be going on before they get to a really bad place. And that's one way to do it. On the other hand, I can talk about social health and like basically do people are they building meaningful relationships within the military where they feel like they can open up around those topics? And then two, the blocker to that being stigma around showing weakness or showing your struggles. And I guess one on the social health part, what is the military doing to, well, one, my external perception, or at least what's been marketed to me about the military is like strong relationships are built inside. You become lifelong brothers and sisters, and so that's my external perception, but I don't actually know what it's like for most people in the military today? And then two, on the stigma side, what progress do you see being made there?
So I'll try and answer both of those as well as I can. I think there is something to the idea that the best bonding is through shared suffering.
Trauma bonding.
I mean, everybody in the military has like stories they can tell about whatever deployment or whatever exercise or whatever it was they did, that they went through some really hard stuff and they ended up being really close with those people for the rest of their lives. There's lots of that. But there's also the element of like trying to create less traumatic versions of that when you can. And units do invest in that kind of thing and they do put effort towards that. But I'll tell you, it was our last conversation, Newton, that got me really thinking about that. And I plan to take that like meaningful social connection metric to be a pretty important one on any kind of programs I'm involved in. And then on the stigma piece, you have, I mean, first of all, you have really senior leaders openly having the stigma conversation all the time on purpose to address that kind of thing. He just retired like a week or two ago, but the most recent Sergeant Major of the Army, Sergeant Major Grinston, was a like spoke often on that kind of stuff and his own journey and things like that. And we've seen other senior leaders, both on the officer and non-commissioned officer side in the Army, talking about that. And I'm confident that that same kind of thing is happening across the branches, trying to deal with it. But the nature of stigmas is that they change slowly. So it takes a lot of conversations in a lot of different places. And people aren't going to trust that something has changed just because they hear it one time from one person. So that process is ongoing.
Case in point, and Alex and I sort of joke about this in a dark comedy way. Like if you've sought behavioral health prior to wanting to join the military, you can't join the military. But yet when you're in the military, like to Alex's point, senior leaders are talking all the time about how you should seek those kinds of services. So it's just little examples like that, I think, that gets to the stigma and the culture. And I kind of think back to one of the things we discussed earlier about how it mimics society. And I think societally, we've seen that mental health is becoming much more of an easier topic to talk about. And I would say, having now been embedded with the military for a long time, it's definitely shifted, and it is something that is people are more comfortable with, but there is still largely a distrust around the military medical system. And so you're seeing more of those conversations happen at the level of the embedded civilian staff, I think.
Yeah, there's an element of that standards of medical fitness for military service come from law, like they are legislated by Congress. And I think we're starting to see more and more pressure, especially as recruiting gets hard right now. There are an awful lot of people who would love to serve their country who are excluded from doing so for a variety of reasons. And there's conversations to be had about whether those reasons are up to date and accurate based on the data we have and things like that. Drew mentioned the mental health stuff. If you sought mental health treatment within X number of years before you attempt to enlist, you're either going to need a waiver or you're just going to get a no on being able to join the military. But we're in a world today where more teenagers go seek that help instead of getting to a crisis, right? Like it's become more mainstream and acceptable and destigmatized to seek actual mental health care. And that our standards of medical fitness have not kept up with that evolution in how civilians seek care. And there's the same kind of thing. I just had conversations a couple of weeks ago about like ADD and ADHD diagnoses. More adults are diagnosed and medicated for that now. More kids are diagnosed and medicated for that now. And in general, I think it's if you've been medicated for it within the last 2 years, you're not eligible for military service. Even though people get diagnosed with it when they're already in uniform and they just get medication and they continue serving, we will prevent people from joining if that's on their medical record.
But hey, you can wear your hair in a ponytail now, so let's bump those recruitment numbers up.
That's interesting. So let's say I have mental health struggles. I have not been diagnosed, but if I think about the things that are supportive of mental health, let's say I'm a young person and I am lacking meaning and purpose, social connection, direction, physical fitness. I might say, hey, the military is a good route for me, but to get in, I have to hide this. And this specific policy implies there is something wrong with me or not fit to be part of this if I have mental health struggles. So I will hide it.
Mm-hmm.
It's accurate. I saw it recently. Like a recruiter said to a kid, like, you're going to be asked the following questions and your answer determines what happens here. Yes stands for your enlistment stops. So yeah, telling people to hide things. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And sorry, I'm just thinking about like the rates I hear about number of teens who have mental health struggles. I'm like, so you have,
Especially post COVID, where people were isolated and not getting exercise and not getting outside. Yeah, it's anxiety and depression skyrocketed.
wow. So you've effectively just canceled out that whole portion of the population because I'm like, they were diagnosed. So sorry, no
Mm-hmm.
to you. And then for everyone else, they now have the yes, your enlistment stops here choice to
Mm-hmm.
make.
Yeah.
Yeah. And waivers do exist, and it's not completely cut and dry, but I do think that is a place where some smart legislation could solve a lot of issues for a lot of people.
Okay, wow.
Fun fact.
I'm sorry, my head is swimming in conflicting incentives right now. I'm
Welcome to
trying
the
to wrap my head
military,
around it.
Newton.
If you haven't read Catch 22, we're pretty big on cognitive dissonance around the DoD.
um, let's dive into maybe one of the last aspects of health and well-being. Well, I mean they're infinite, but one of the last ones on my list is, if we called it spiritual health, spirituality, and the way I think about that, if I have to explain it in a secular context, is uh, your connection with yourself, with others, and something greater that knits you together. And if you can check those boxes in a meaningful way, you can live a pretty rich spiritual life. And so that's definitely a huge aspect of the human experience. Like I don't get a lot of pushback on that concept and that definition. But how does the military think about something so kind of broad and squishy, but that we all seem to agree is important?
I think that it's an interesting one because you have the chaplain corps, which has been around for forever, literally since the start of the military. And I think the spirituality conversation, I would argue, is in its infancy. And because of that, a lot of senior leaders have just sort of dumped it onto the chaplain corps. And so it then becomes you have to get over that hurdle of like, is it religion or is it spirituality? Is it Christianity or is it connection with like, I mean, you kind of know where that goes, but it's, in my opinion, it is the grayest of gray areas. But I see it improving over the years because everybody's aware of the fact of how gray it is.
Yeah, I'd agree that we're starting to figure it out. Chaplains, by the way, their branch of the military, or their branch of the army, at least, and I think it's the same in the other services, they have to be endorsed by a particular faith, like a particular church has to endorse them for them to be able to serve. So they are all denominationally affiliated. So that gets a little bit complicated, but they also understand that they're there to provide for free exercise of religion for all service members, regardless of their faith tradition or lack thereof. And so some are better at it than others, and some have different backgrounds and biases and things like that, and they're working on it. And certainly, I think it's important to note that like lumping that responsibility onto our chaplains is probably not appropriate because we all have a piece of the spiritual conversation. I don't think it's entirely in their hands to solve that. But Drew and I had a really good episode a few weeks back with Colonel Klepper from 173rd Airborne, their brigade out in Italy, and they've prioritized spiritual kind of stuff, and he talked a lot about how those interventions are most effective when they're delivered by somebody that's part of the organization that understands what everybody's going through, that they know and they see on a daily basis. You can't really outsource it. And he was a huge advocate. And I was actually just talking like 2 days ago with the chaplain I'll be working with here about this, but he has some great examples where they seek out pretty significant adversity and hardship. Like they take these guys into the mountains of Italy and put them through some like really hard hikes in the mountains in the winter and things like that. And then as part of that, there's a discussion about like what drives you, what keeps you going through hardship, what motivates you to overcome these things, where do you go to for a sense of stability in hard times and things like that. And we're starting to crack that one a little bit. I think we're starting to figure out what works and what helps and how it looks, but it's squishy. Like you said, it's tough. It's hard to nail down.
Can you talk a little bit more about, so there's the chaplains, they have a service role, like if someone comes to them, but then there's a larger conversation about how do you elevate this topic of spirituality in the military context. And that sounds like a really interesting starting point where you have this embedded function. If I think about corporations, you kind of just need someone who's decided to say, I'm going to advocate for this, even though it wasn't exactly on the job description. And so if I think about in my own context, I'll advocate for it when the opportunity arises. Others, just grassroots throughout the organization, will, but it's not like there's no role with responsibilities to advocate for this. Like, can you talk a little bit about with chaplains in the system, like how have they advocated for it and what's been successful in driving progress?
So from my experience with chaplains, and we talked about this, I think at length, several episodes ago when we had Chris Picorni on. He's a chaplain within special operations. The ones that are really good are the ones that understand that the point of connection, human to human, happens outside of the religious conversation 9 times out of 10. And usually that involves being side by side with the guys or gals that are out in the field doing the thing, stepping away from, again, kind of the religious piece. And if in conversation it becomes important to include that, then absolutely do it. But I've seen chaplains be very, very successful creating those inroads when they approach it almost from the level of like the social worker or the psychologist, quote unquote, versus, hey, come to my sermon on Sunday. And you still see a lot of, I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but like a lot of antiquated approaches to the chaplaincy piece in the military, where they do focus mostly on the church component, the religion component, and then they wonder why today's modern soldier doesn't necessarily connect with them. So I think the ones that are really good, unfortunately, are not the majority, and that's not to knock chaplains because there's a lot of good ones out there. But I think that the field itself is seeing a big shift because they're starting to learn that they do need to find a way to connect with this embedded performance aspect, this almost performance spirituality component. And what does that even look like?
I will say, as a brief aside, I have a long list of books I want to read that I haven't read yet, but at the top of that list right now is Soul Boom by Rainn Wilson. And yes, like Dwight Schrute of The Office.
I have an interesting story about that. He actually came to my Google office to do a talk on that book. I was camped outside the room so that I didn't get shut out. The meeting I was in ran long, and I missed it by about 2 minutes. So I was watching it live stream from 10 feet outside the freaking room.
No.
I will say, if you read it, I am blown away by, I think, the ambition of that book to take on the topic of spirituality and the need for a spiritual revolution in society, and in the breadth that he's approached it, as well as his level of research. Like I'm like, oh, you are so much more than Dwight Schrute. You pretty much have a PhD in this stuff. It is breathtaking. Highly
That's awesome to hear. Okay. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, I probably first heard about the book from your Instagram page, Newton. So appreciate that.
Okay.
But it's sitting high on my list. I gotta finish up the one I'm reading right now, and it'll probably be next. Before we go further, it is 6:28 my time. Are we bumping up against your hard stop, Newton?
Yeah, I probably have time for like one closer here.
Perfect.
So if I had to, let's see if this is a 2-minute question. Wipe the slate clean and say you get to design the system or aspects of the system for maintaining or supporting the readiness of the military from a health and well-being approach. What are some things that you would do completely different?
So my answer to this one addresses both corporate wellness and military human performance. I think in both cases, we're trying to put a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
Mm-hmm.
I would start with federal policy, federal level, like national level messaging, societal level kind of stuff, getting education on this back into schools, caring about it for kids, caring about the like nutrition and sleep and physical activity that our kids get when they're in middle school and high school and elementary school and all that kind of stuff. I think we would see bigger returns on investment if we prioritized interventions like this in public education. Yeah.
My quick answer would be that I would, and this is more at the granular, like boots on the ground level, I would allow for this new wave of human performance. And by that, I mean sort of the embedded civilian led initiatives around human performance. I would allow those things to take point and not just drive discussion around, okay, this works. How can we then take power away from the civilian piece and put it back on the active duty piece? Because when human performance becomes an additional duty as opposed to a primary and singular duty, it gets watered down. And we're already seeing some of that happen where we've seen success because we've been at this for a couple of years now. And senior leaders say, oh, great. Well, then how can we just make this something that soldiers can do so we don't have to rely on spending the money to have the non-active duty folks, run the show? And I think it goes back to conversations around, how much from a dollar standpoint is that healthy soldier really worth to you? Is it the cost of the contract to have the subject matter expert with years of experience on the ground running the show? Or is it more important to you to get rid of that and save a couple dollars and just put it on top of this already overtasked individual? So I would take from what we know works well in the collegiate space, the professional space, having really, really high level professional folks treating human performance like a really high level professional thing, as opposed to just thinking that, oh, we can do that ourselves because we've been doing push-ups, sit-ups, and jumping jacks for the last 100 years.
And I think on that note, those are two things where I think they apply equally to our contexts.
Mm-hmm.
How do we move upstream and arm the next generation? And how do we, you said the ROI on a soldier. I could say ROI on a software engineer, a salesperson, a business analyst. And I think it is a key question to hopefully drive better support for the health and well-being of, not just soldiers, but people across society. And I think society would benefit in so many ways. So I think that's hopefully this conversation, I would love to continue it. Maybe we go do something. Let's start a conference and bring together more voices and talk about this, or who knows? That's not a promise. I'm not speaking on behalf of Google here. I'm just a curious guy who happens to work for Google.
Yeah, if Google wants to host it, we'll be there. Or if we host it, you're invited. Don't worry.
Okay, well, let's keep talking. Drew, Alex, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for giving me the space to interview you. I learned a lot, and I hope this is valuable to your audience.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having us on our podcast.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. With that, I hand the podcast back to you. Thank you for loaning it out. And I got to drop off and go to a meeting now.
Adios.
Enjoy.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.